Happy Memorial Day, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Hell Let Loose for PC, Xbox Series X and S, and PlayStation 5. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a multiplayer-only tactical first-person shooter developed by Black Matter Party Limited and published by Team 17 that was first released into early access in 2019, and it saw its full release on PC in 2021, with the console version following soon after. Upon its original release, the game was pretty well received, but the developers didn't just rest on their laurels. They did continue to develop the game and put out patches for various glitches and such, and they also implemented additional content later on down the line. In fact, as I'm recording this video, they just introduced an update which added the British forces to the game along with a couple of maps that are associated with the British forces, such as El Alamein, as well as introduced some additional systems to make communicating without a microphone a lot easier, and also some tweaks to the gameplay mechanics. So it's still a game that is actively being supported by its developer and publisher, and the community is still going strong. It has remained stable for 2 years at this point. So what's exactly going on with Hell Let Loose? Is it a game that you should pick up and give a try, or is it something else entirely? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on Unreal Engine 4 and immediately starts to run into problems because of that. More specifically, it has pretty severe performance issues if you boot the game up without running it in DirectX 12 mode. The thing is, there's no option in the menu to switch it over to DirectX 12 mode. You have to specifically go in and put a command line argument into Steam in order for it to actually run in that. It's a very easy thing to tweak, but if you don't do that, you'll find that even on my hardware right now, which is a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 3080 12GB model, it doesn't really run better than about 55 to 65 frames per second at 1080p, which is, needless to say, pretty ridiculous for a game that's been out for several years at this point. The thing is, if you switch it over to DirectX 12 mode, it basically never goes below about 90 to 95 frames per second and is usually well over 100 frames per second on the same hardware. And while the performance gains weren't anywhere near as high on my previous rig, which was an i7 4790K 16 gigs of RAM and a GTX 1080, it was still a significant performance boost going from the standard running of the game to putting it in DirectX 12 mode. Now you would think with that being a pretty massive performance boost that they would either just have it run natively in DirectX 12 mode or at least give you the option to switch over to that in the options menu, but they've never put that in the options menu in the entire time the game's been out, and that has been not only a performance issue but also the same exact fix for as long as the game has been out. So that's certainly confusing and actually a bit irritating, but at least it's something you can kind of work around. The thing is, even if you do switch it over to DirectX 12 mode and the frame rate dramatically improves, you're still going to be having some weird stuttering issues here and there, which I think is related to the game trying to load things in. I'm running this on an SSD, a rather fast SSD for that matter, and yet it still has that stuttering issue on a pretty frequent basis, especially when you're first starting out a match, because it's still loading everything in, and then by the time you get the match really going, you're not really noticing the stuttering quite as much. It does still occasionally happen, but it's nowhere near as severe as when you first jump into a match. This is another issue that's been in the game for quite a while, and I'm not entirely sure if it's something that they're even capable of fixing just because it might be an issue with Unreal Engine 4 in general. It's hard to say for sure, but suffice to say, the game does have some performance issues, and while they're just a bit annoying for somebody who's running rather high-end hardware, if you're running a bit mid-range or lower-end hardware, they're something to be a bit more aware of because they can actually start to interfere with your ability to play the game. So you might need to lower some graphics settings there. This, of course, leads me over into the graphics themselves. What is this game doing that's justifying the performance issues? Well, the main thing that it's doing is that it has 100 player servers. So each match you go into is going to be 2 teams of 50 players each, at maximum anyway, going up against each other in all-out warfare. With that stipulation, it is fair to assume that the graphics are not going to be top of the line compared to a lot of AAA games that have much smaller player counts but are able to bump up the fidelity. That said, Hell Let Loose does have rather solid visuals. It's got great modeling, it's got good texture quality, the animations, especially the weapon handling animations, are pretty solid, and despite the maps being huge, they do have quite a lot of detail packed into them. Because of all of this, it's a pretty taxing game on your hardware, so it's understandable why especially mid and lower range computers are not necessarily going to run this thing all that well. At least not without sacrificing some visual fidelity, and I think most people are okay with that as long as they can continue to play the game and it doesn't really adversely affect what they're doing. That said, there are still quite a few technical problems, namely things like performance, that they definitely still need to sort out, and it's definitely frustrating that even though the game's been out for a couple of years at this point, they still haven't fixed them. Moving over into the sound design, this is where things also can be a bit disappointing. There's not much in the way of music in the game. It plays a victory theme for each faction when you finish a match, and it'll always play the victory theme of whichever faction won the match, regardless of which team you're on. But those are all licensed tracks, so the only really original music the game has is the main menu theme, which is a fairly typical war movie kind of thing, and it works fine for the game. But it is only main menu music, so you're only going to be hearing that as long as you're on the main menu and in the server browser and such. So there's not really anything to talk about in terms of soundtrack, and there's also not really anything to talk about in terms of voice acting, because the only voice stuff in the game is just gurgling and screaming in pain and things like that, which all works perfectly fine, don't get me wrong, it's just there's not really much to talk about there either. And then you move over into the gun and explosion sounds, which are going to be the main thing you're probably going to be concerned about in a first-person shooter like this. And while they're certainly not the worst I've ever heard, they just don't really have a whole lot behind them. Guns themselves just don't sound like they have much punch, regardless of what you're using, whether it's a pistol or a submachine gun or a rifle or whatever, and the explosions are surprisingly quiet and dull. That's not to say that every single sound is bad. They do have supersonic cracks for rifle fire and such, and the sound of artillery pieces going off is actually fairly powerful, and that of course does include tank cannons as well. But most of what you're going to be hearing is the infantry's small arms and their grenades and such, and those just don't really have much going behind them, so they're less satisfying to use than they really could be. And when you bring all of that presentation together, you do end up with something that is overall pretty solid, but there's just certain aspects of it that are really disappointing, and some aspects of it that definitely need to be fixed, namely things like the technical problems that it has. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, or at least the gameplay, because there isn't really a story in Hell Let Loose. It's World War II. You're playing as either the Allies or the Axis, and that's it. Although the Axis in this case is only Germany for the moment, and the Allies are currently the US, the Soviet Union, and as of the most recent update, the British forces. Regardless of which team you're on, you're going to be playing one of two game modes across a variety of maps that are based on various historical battles. But regardless of whether you're fighting in the deserts at El Alamein, or storming the beaches of Normandy, or fighting in the frozen wastelands of the Eastern Front, you'll find that the gameplay experience of Hell Let Loose is remarkably different from what you're used to in pretty much any other military-themed first-person shooter. You see, each team is organized into squads. You can have 3 types of squads. These are infantry squads, which are pretty self-explanatory. They run around with guns of various types, and they can accomplish infantry things. There's armor squads, which are also relatively self-explanatory in the sense that they are the crews of tanks and such like that. And then there are recon squads, which are squads that can actually go pretty far behind enemy lines and are meant to help scout out the enemy, thus being able to provide valuable intelligence for their team. But not only that, they can also harass the enemy behind their own lines and go and take out things like enemy artillery positions, which can absolutely wreak havoc if they're left to their own devices. Recon squads consist of a spotter and a sniper, and you only get 2 recon squads per team. Armor squads consist of a tank commander, or vehicle commander, I guess you would be better to say, as well as 2 crew members, and then infantry squads consist of a squad leader along with 5 other squad members, each of which can select various different classes, from things like rifleman to engineer to anti-tank to machine gunner and so on and so forth. Each team also has a single slot available for a commander. This is an incredibly important role that is basically trying to coordinate all of the efforts of the team, and to facilitate this they have various special abilities that will support their team's efforts. Things like being able to call in recon flyovers, as well as things like airstrikes or calling in additional support vehicles and so on and so forth. But while the commander's job is coordinating the efforts of the team, it's not just a matter of the commander has to be really good for the team to succeed. The team needs to support the commander as well, because they can't call in their various support abilities without resources, which can be increased by the various squads building up resource nodes. As the various resource nodes get built, you'll also notice that squads are building outposts as well as garrisons. Outposts are smaller spawn points that squad leaders can put up so that their squads can spawn on those points, whereas garrisons are spawn points that anybody on the team can spawn at. They can be built by either the commander or squad leaders as long as there are enough supplies in the vicinity, and this combination of outposts and garrisons makes for far more dynamic gameplay than you would expect out of a slower-paced first-person shooter like this. Most military shooters you see out there, even the ones that are slower-paced and more tactical, like, say, Squad or something along those lines, have fixed spawn points somewhere on the map, and thus whenever you need to respawn, you have to go back to those points, and there's a bit of a lull in the action between when you start at that spawn point and when you get to wherever the enemy is. That's not necessarily what happens in Hell Let Loose, because those outposts and garrisons can be put pretty much anywhere on the map. There are some restrictions there. There are certain spots on the map that you just can't put anything down of that sort, and you also can't put down a garrison too close to another garrison, but if a particular squad wants to deploy somewhere behind enemy lines, they can set up an outpost over there and do exactly that. If a squad wants to deploy on the point and defend it, they can also do that. And all of that goes for either team. So what you find is that what ultimately wins battles in Hell Let Loose isn't just a matter of coordinating with your team to attack a given point. It's really more of a matter of map control, just controlling the territory on the map so that the enemy can't mount effective defenses or offenses, thus allowing your team to effectively mount offenses or defenses in order to ultimately win the match. Now you might say something along the lines of, but DW, that's how pretty much any multiplayer team-based first-person shooter or action game in general is going to go. But that's really not the case. Most other action games of this type focus far more on the control points themselves, rather than the combination of building up the support structure for your team and controlling the map around the objective, not just at the objective, that is highly emphasized by Hell Let Loose. After all, in most other first-person shooters of this type, if you capture a point, you can then spawn at that point. You might have a spawn cooldown timer, but you still have the ability to spawn at that point. That's not what happens in Hell Let Loose. If you capture a point and you don't have garrisons and outposts nearby, you can't spawn near that objective. And if your team can't spawn near the objective, then they're not going to be able to control that objective. And moreover, you're also going to annoy the living crap out of your teammates, because if you don't have garrisons and outposts set up near the objective, then your team's going to be doing an awful lot of running across a very large map. And while people don't mind that as much when you're first starting the match out and nobody has any garrisons or outposts set up, the further you get into the match, the more frustrating the lack of any kind of support structures is going to be. And there's not really much you can do as an individual player to remedy that. In fact, individual players don't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of Hell Let Loose. Running around with, say, a rifle and shooting at enemies is fine and all, it's obviously something you should be doing in this game, but your individual KD ratio has absolutely no bearing on whether your team is actually going to win or not. Your ability to snipe enemies from half a mile away is certainly annoying for them, but that doesn't really mean much if they're able to call in artillery on your position or just get behind you or any number of things like that. And while enemies do go down in 1 or 2 hits from basically any of the weapons, and all of the weapons are actually quite satisfying to use as a result, it really doesn't matter all that much how well you do as a first-person shooter player. If you were to play something like Call of Duty, your KD ratio matters a lot, your individual player skill matters a lot. In something like Hell Let Loose, it's really your contribution to the team that matters the most. It's all well and good if you can drop a few enemies here and there, or you chuck a grenade in the right place and it takes out an entire enemy squad along with their spawn point or whatever. But if you're not good at that sort of thing, then you can pick a different class like, say, the medic, and get people back up on their feet so you can get more bodies on the control point and make sure that the enemy doesn't overrun it, or if you're on offense, overrun it yourselves. Or you can pick the engineer and build the resource nodes that your commander really needs to be able to bring those support powers in, as well as build up fortifications around the map to deny the enemy access to key positions, as well as put down things like landmines so that if an enemy tank rolls over it, then, well, they have a bad day. Or you can pick the support class and make sure that supplies get to where they need to go, and generally just, well, support other classes in whatever they're trying to accomplish. And even if you can't pick one of the classes that's in a support role, you can still pick a more standard infantry class like rifleman or automatic rifleman or machine gunner or whatever. And even if you can't necessarily hit anything, as long as you're laying down suppressive fire and calling out where the enemy is and what they're bringing to the table, you're still contributing to the success of your team. This is why the most important weapon in your arsenal in Hell Let Loose is not the various guns that you're running around with, it's not the grenades you're chucking at enemies, it's not the tanks rolling in to blast the enemy to pieces, it's not artillery barrages or airstrikes, it's communication. If you are not communicating with your teammates and on a much more micro level your squad mates, then you're just not going to win, and you're also not going to have a good time. It's not just a matter of friendly banter. Your teammates need to know where the enemy's coming, what they are bringing to the table, where the enemy spawn points might be, anything that seems out of place, where you need to put spawn points down, where you need to put supplies down so that they can build those spawn points, where resource nodes need to be built, where artillery support is needed, so on and so forth. And the game gives you incredibly important tools for being able to do this. The first of them is voice chat. There are 2 channels effectively for most players, but for squad leaders and the commander there are 3 voice channels. The first of these is squad level chat, where you can communicate with all of the members of your squad regardless of where you are on the map. The second one is local chat, which is limited to just a small radius around you, but you can talk to any of your teammates in that area. The third of them, the one that's only available to squad leaders and the commander, is command chat, where the squad leaders and the commander try to coordinate to make sure that everything gets to where it needs to be in order to ultimately secure victory. And if you go into the community-run servers, you find very quickly that one of the top rules for basically all of them is that squad leaders and the commander need to have functioning microphones, because that communication is just that important. You can certainly get by without a microphone if you're running around as infantry. It's definitely more difficult to do it without a microphone, but you can do it. There are ways to ping what you're trying to point at, you can use the text chat, and of course they introduced some additional communication options in the most recent update, which I don't really use because I use a microphone, but there are some canned callouts that they provide so you can quickly communicate what you need or what you're trying to tell people at any given moment. Obviously, it's not as effective as voice chat, but it's better than nothing, and unfortunately, a lot of players don't use the other methods of communication, which quickly can lead into the failure spiral where your team is not communicating, they are not coordinating, and then they just get completely steamrolled. Needless to say, that can be rather frustrating, and it highlights the single biggest strength and weakness, really, of Hell Let Loose. The experience you'll have playing Hell Let Loose will ultimately be dictated by the people you're playing it with. If you are playing with people who are communicating well, who are working together as a team, you're probably going to have an absolutely fantastic time. If you're not playing with people who are communicating and coordinating well, then you're probably going to have a miserable time. And that's regardless of which mode you're playing. There are only 2 modes in the game, offensive and warfare. In offensive, There's one team that's on offense and the other team is on defense. The offensive team is trying to capture the various points on the map in individual succession. They capture the first point, defenders fall back to the next point, they try to capture the next point, so on and so forth until eventually they capture all the points. In the warfare mode, on the other hand, both teams are fighting for control of the entire map, sector by sector, and they need to capture the strong point within that sector in order to move on to the next sector. This mode allows for back and forth gameplay where you can capture a point, but then the enemy team can capture it back, and then you go back to capturing that point, and so on and so forth. Whereas the offensive game mode is you capture the point, and then the defending team cannot recapture that point and have to fall back to the next point. Both modes are on timers as well, with the timer on the warfare game mode being quite long at about an hour, whereas the timer on the offensive game mode is more variable because every time the attacking team manages to capture a point, it adds additional time to the timer so they can move on and capture the next point. Either way, each match of Hell Let Loose is going to be one that takes quite a while to finish. You're looking at pretty much a minimum of 30 minutes or more to finish a match, with the ones that are much more evenly matched being much closer to the hour in length. That is a long time to spend playing a single match of a multiplayer first-person shooter, so obviously you want to make sure that you're really enjoying that experience if you're doing so. And if your team is not communicating, then that amount of time feels like it can be wasted and it can be immensely frustrating. On the other hand, if your team is coordinating and communicating really well, even if you lose, it's not necessarily frustrating. It can still be pretty exhilarating sometimes if you're communicating and coordinating well with your team, but you simply get outplayed by the other team. And given how matches can really come down to the wire if both teams are coordinating and communicating well, it can be a really intense situation that you just don't get with other first-person shooters. The only other games that come kind of close to that are the likes of, say, Squad, and even something like Squad doesn't have quite the same kind of dynamic gameplay that Hell Let Loose does. And so when everything's firing on all cylinders, when you get that team that's coordinating well and communicating well, everybody's playing their various roles in the squad well, you've got the support of the armor and recon squads, and you've got the good commander going in there and getting things done, it can end up being an absolutely phenomenal experience. But then at the same time, if everything isn't firing on all cylinders, it quickly becomes incredibly frustrating, and there's really not a whole lot of in-between there. And unfortunately, even when the game is firing on all cylinders, there may still be some issue that comes up that gets incredibly irritating. Especially things like the number of glitches the game has, some of which have been in the game for a long time and still haven't been resolved. Like the especially annoying glitch with the communication system where you'll try to use your voice chat, but it just doesn't work. And you might have to restart the game, or you might just have to disconnect and reconnect to the voice chat system, and you might have to do that multiple times, and it just gets incredibly annoying, although thankfully that one doesn't occur anywhere near as commonly as it used to. And then, of course, things like performance issues and weird physics glitches and things like that that just can get kind of annoying sometimes. But then there are things like design decisions where things like the British weapons that they just introduced are pretty much all terrible, and you can't really hit much of anything with them because the sights are awful, and more importantly, they seem to be sighted in wrong so that you're having to constantly compensate for your shots rather than being able to just directly aim at things. Whereas if you were using the weapons that the other factions use, then yeah, you can still have to compensate for long-range shots, but if it's more close range, then you just put the sights right on the enemy and you're able to drop them. And then of course there's always the frustration of being picked off by an unseen enemy. That's in any first-person shooter though. But anyway, the point is that Hell Let Loose is definitely not a perfect experience. It's got decent enough gunplay for what they're going for, but it's not the best gunplay ever or anything. The movement speed was rather slow until they put up the new update where they increased the sprint speed by quite a lot. It's still nowhere near as fast as any number of more arcadey first-person shooters, but you no longer feel like you're just kind of leisurely strolling along when you're supposed to be sprinting. And funnily enough, a lot of the community were bitching about how now you actually feel like you're sprinting as opposed to just leisurely strolling, so take that for what it's worth, I guess. And then, of course, there's things like the performance issues, the glitches, and so on and so forth. It is definitely not a remotely perfect experience. But, of course, weapon balancing, performance issues, glitches, all that sort of thing can definitely be sorted out by patches. Not all of it has been sorted out by patches yet, but there's always the potential for it, and there's also likelihood that a lot of those things will be patched. And even when it's firing on all cylinders, as great as Hell Let Loose can be, it's still a game that I have a hard time just fully recommending to just about anybody, unless you are willing to put up with a lot of the shortcomings that the game has. It requires a ton of patience to play Hell Let Loose. It is simply not the kind of game that you can just jump into, play it for maybe an hour or so, have a good grasp of what you're doing, and be able to really enjoy the experience. It is a game you have to take your time with, one that you have to learn the roles in and out in order to truly get the most out of it. And that's just going to take time and patience, and not everybody has that. In fact, I would argue most people probably don't have that. But for those of you out there who are looking for a very teamwork-oriented first-person shooter, Hell Let Loose is one of the better ones out there, if not arguably the best one out there at the moment. The thing is, the experience of Hell Let Loose is going to be defined almost entirely by the people you're playing it with, rather than the game itself, because the game itself is a great framework for what you actually experience in the game, as long as everybody's using that framework to its fullest. If they're not doing that, though, then, well, frankly, it doesn't really matter how good the game is on its own. And at the end of the day, I have to take that into consideration with regards to this review. As such, I am ultimately giving Hell Let Loose a 3.5 out of 5, with the following stipulation. If everything's firing on all cylinders, if everybody's communicating, if everybody's coordinating, it's really a 4 out of 5, leaning closer even to a 4.5 out of 5. The experience can be that good if everything's firing on all cylinders. Otherwise, it's a 3.5 out of 5 at best. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that's just going to happen when you have a game that is really solid on its own, but whose experience is just ultimately defined by the people you're playing it with. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.